Hi folks, how you doing? Today is Friday. It is the 17th day of May, 2024. It's about 2:30 in the afternoon in relatively slightly overcast Tampa, Florida. How are you? I've got two quick videos to make for you this afternoon. The first one's going to be obviously this one, and it's going to deal with taking a closer look at the numbers that are being used to justify what's happening in Gaza. And I know it's going to get me the moniker of Holocaust revisionist. So they're going to start referring to the 1,200 civilians who were massacred on October the 7th as the next Holocaust. I'm sure at some point, but it's important to be factual when you talk about what's happening, especially when they're doing things like trying to divide in half by half the number of children who were killed in Gaza since October the 7th by the Israeli Defense Forces, the IDF. That number now stands at 15,103. 15,103 children killed by the IDF. The total number of children under the age of 18, Israeli civilians, killed on October the 7th, if memory serves, was 36 during the quote-unquote, during the attack. Do not have details as of yet, and won't have details as long as this conflict goes on because I'm not allowed to do an investigation. But we don't have details as of yet in terms of how many of them were killed by the IDF as opposed to the Palestinians. But that number is at 36, and only 10 of them were under the age of 12. Remember when it was 40 beheaded babies? I'm just saying. A lot of them were killed in those vehicles. I'm going to show you a picture of those vehicles, by the way. I've talked about them before, the ones that they shredded and they mushed up and they compressed and then they buried in Jewish cemeteries, claiming that there's still part of Jewish people inside the cars and so on the metal. Therefore, they have to be buried in Jewish cemeteries. And the thing about Jewish cemeteries is you can't dig up bodies and for any kind of, once a body is buried in a Jewish cemetery, it's buried. You can't fucking bring it back up and dig it up and do an investigation. So that's why they did that. That's how they're hiding that evidence. Numbers are important. That's why they keep trying to revise the numbers down of kids being killed. I also want to say this, just right off the bat, and it's not really something that's it does have to do with this. A lot of people are giving Bill Burr credit for making Bill Maher look like a sellout jackass, contemptuous sellout jackass that he is, on his own podcast when he had Bill Burr come on. I've said this before about Bill Burr. He destroyed Ethan from H3H3 when he had him on there. He made him, without doing anything except being Bill Burr, he destroyed Ethan. He set Ethan into a fucking... Ethan was one of these guys, he's a influencer, he used to do jackass little funny things, skits and stuff on YouTube back when you could pretty much get away with anything. And he made himself into a multi-millionaire doing that stupid shit. And so, of course, then the next thing for them to do is become a podcaster because he's rich. He's got to be so fucking smart. And he thought he was always the smartest guy in the fucking room, or at least in the studio. And he brought Bill Burr in, and it didn't go very well for him. This is something that Bill Maher should not have been fucking surprised about. I'll give you just a brief rundown. You can see it. There's all kinds of places out there. I'm not going to play it. But there's all kinds of places talking about it, including TYT. And they're giving Bill Burr a big pat on the back for doing this, and rightly so to some degree. to some degree. But of course, what Bill Burr didn't do is really take it to him. He exposed him. He exposed Bill Maher for being the sycophantic sellout he's become. I saw these two guys talking about this episode, about this exchange, in which basically Bill Maher takes the side of the glorious Israelis and says, oh yeah, blowing up kids is bad, but, he's got to be the adult in the room, and sometimes hard decisions have to be made to save what? Killing 15,000 children is justified to save what? To stop people from on dirt bikes from coming through the fence and shooting a few of your fucking soldiers. That's got to happen. And of course, Bill Burr says, "Stop trying to sound like a fucking general." He's just spouting. He's just exposed him spouting the stupid propaganda in support of glorious Israel. And then of course Bill Maher says, he says, that's very brave of you to make that, to make that call there, Bill. Burr did to Maher. And of course Maher says, I am the courageous one here, because of course he's making the hard decisions, is what he's trying to suggest. Which is ludicrous. I mean, abso-fucking-lutely ludicrous. Bill Maher lives in the green zone of Hollywood. And I'm sure he's always being, chastised by all the Hollywood types for his stance with glorious Israel, which of course is laughable. It's not the courageous position. It's the easy, cowardly position. And as these two guys I saw talking about this, one of them stated, if you're older, like myself and some of us out there, then you remember Bill Maher back in his day when it was easy to oppose the establishment because the establishment was Dick Cheney and Richard Pearl and Condi Rice and all the other fucking neocons who were waging a fucking war of aggression against Iraq. And these individuals, or this one guy in this talk was as he rightly pointed out, Bill Maher was on the right side back then. And Bill Maher often talked about how they would call you a terrorist supporter if you opposed our fucking war of aggression in Iraq. And they would do so loudly and in your face. And I know because I was down here in Tampa at the time, and I was out in the streets and I was protesting and I was doing stuff. And people were, this is fucking Tampa. This is a lot of people make their money in the global war of terror. So, I'm certainly, and I remember Bill Maher taking a very courageous stand against people being called, a terrorist supporter or a raghead lover or whatever the fuck else there were a lot of them, in order to try to silence people from saying exactly what is obvious and what is right, that we had no business attacking Iraq or Afghanistan for that matter, over what happened on September 11th, 2001. And they certainly over the weapons of mass destruction that they knew didn't exist even before going in. Bill Maher was on the right side of that and was calling out that fucking propaganda. Now, of course, he's, you stand with Hamas? Well, really, you're a terrorist supporter? Now Bill Maher is using those same kinds of fucking slurs to try to stifle dissent or free speech or free thinking, for that matter. Now, all that said, Bill Burr gets is getting praised for this when he really didn't do anything. All he really said was, I stand with the kids. And he was referring to the kids having a right to free speech on college campuses. Bill Maher assumed that he was talking about the 15,103 children who've been slaughtered viciously by the most moral army in the world. It was like, well, you can't stand with Hamas. These kids talking about the protesters, they're standing with Hamas. He was like, well, they're standing with Palestine. And Bill Maher says, well, that's the same thing, isn't it? Do you stand with Hamas? I want to make this very clear to everybody out there. If there's ever any question, I stand with Hamas. I stand with Hamas. And it's not a hard, difficult thing to say. Apparently Bill Burr can't say it. Because then he will be canceled. Because, again, they talked about all kinds of stuff during the podcast, and cancel culture was one of them, which clearly Bill Maher is worried about. He doesn't want to be canceled, so he's going to be on the right side of this. God knows. In TV land and fucking Hollywood, he's not going to have access. He's not going to have, a contract. He was probably getting all kinds of fucking offers after he had that little interview where he said, standing with Palestine is a Palestinian means you're standing with Hamas. I'm sure he, fully expected to get all kinds of calls and offers after voicing that opinion, which he probably did, because treachery is rewarded. If the devil can get you to believe half his lies, then his job is done. Because eventually you'll come around to the other half, just because of convenience. And that's what is happening here. I stand with Hamas. Why? Because Hamas is not a terrorist organization. Hamas is a political party. Hamas is an offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood, which is a political party, which was made illegal after the election, the first election, free election that took place in Egypt, where a guy was elected, and then, of course, we had to get rid of him and install al-Sisi. And then the first thing he did was arrest 1,000+ fucking Muslim Brotherhood fucking members and leaders and party leaders, and then make it fucking illegal to be a member of that particular political party. Imagine if Joe Biden did that with the Republicans. Imagine if he arrested all the fucking Trump supporters. We think it's bad here, what's happening, and it is bad. I mean, he's right now. Trump is fucking is in a fight for his life and his freedom and his money, because he's a threat to the political establishment. We get that. They don't mess around in Egypt. They don't play around. They just arrest him. They don't give a shit. Al-Sisi doesn't give a shit. He's a fucking dictator. That's just a fact. But that's not what Hamas is. Hamas is a political party. Hamas has a military wing, just like the United States government has a military wing. They also have a Department of Education, Department of Health, Ministry of Health, which I'm going to quote in a few minutes here for you, which, by the way, the U.S. State Department recognizes their numbers in terms of how many people have been killed, children have been killed in Gaza, from the Ministry of Health, which, by the way, is part of Hamas. I stand with Hamas. I stand with Hamas in the idea that got Hamas elected, which was, we're not going to bend the knee to the occupying power. We are going to resist, which is why Gaza was what Gaza was, and the West Bank was what the West Bank was. The West Bank, their politicians, their fucking leadership, the Palestinian Authority, Fatah, they sold out. They sold out. And they let the Israelis break up fucking the West Bank into Bantustans, into ghettos, and then use fucking Palestinians as cheap labor. They let them do that. Hamas would not, which is why the IDF and the settlers had to get the fuck out of Gaza in 2006 after the election. But Bill Burr is getting a pat on the back, and everyone's going, good for you, attaboy. He didn't do jack shit other than make fucking a hypocrite, a sellout, expose himself, which is what Bill Maher always does. That's all he did. He did it with a straight face. And like I said, I would never want to interview Bill Burr because he's just, you never know which Bill Burr you're going to get. And if you get the evil Bill Burr, it's going to be a bad day for you. It's going to go really fucking bad. If you get on his bad side, if you say something that's like sycophantic, like what Ethan at H3 did, if you expose yourself as not having done your fucking homework or taking yourself too seriously, Bill Burr will fuck you up. And when Bill Burr fucks you up, it tends to get a lot of attention. So I give him credit for that. However, I don't give him credit. I don't give anyone credit who tries to say, I stand with the Palestinians, but I don't stand with Hamas. I'm not a terrorist supporter. Fuck you. Fuck you. Hamas is not a terror organization. I can't say that enough times. Hamas is not a terror organization. Hamas is a political party. They call them a terror organization because they don't fucking sell out to the fucking Israelis. Ergo, to the Israelis, they are a terror organization. It wasn't an act of terror that took place on October the 7th. I'm going to discuss that right now. And I'm going to show you the numbers right now. And this is why the numbers are important. People think that they went in there and just started slaughtering civilians. The only ones who were slaughtering civilians willy-nilly via the Hannibal Directive were Jewish. They were the Jewish representatives of the Jewish ethnostate. If any, who's more of a right now? Who's more of a terrorist organization, Hamas or the IDF? Forget Likud. Hamas. Well, Likud. Who's more of a terrorist organization? This is something that's also quite relevant and should also be mentioned. All of these efforts to silence us, to keep people, to keep students, to keep young people, they're now saying that they're trying to pass legislation to carefully manipulate the kind of information and history that they'll be allowed to teach in fucking middle schools and high schools. Forget colleges, middle schools and high schools. It's got to be Israel friendly, Zionist friendly. This is desperation. These people are fucking desperate. They're desperate and they're rabid. And they can see it slipping from between their fucking fingers. The pipe dream of their grandfathers and their fathers and their great-grandfathers. That's been, people say, well, this is from a reaction from World War II, and of course that's why, Israel was this goes back to the Balfour Declaration, which, in case you don't know, happened long before World War II. They have wanted this fucking plot of land to steal and take from the people who lived there for quite some time. The only real terrorists involved in this are, of course, the Israelis and the Biden administration for allowing it. That's it. There's no question. They're literally dropping leaflets saying, leave your home, what little bit of a home you've had since you were born, since the Nakba, because Israel's coming in to take your land, because we don't like how you run your fucking country. Let me explain this to you one last time. The definition of terrorism is thus. If you use violence or the threat of violence to change a government, a country's government, either politically, socially, or economically, then that, by the way, is terrorism. That's the definition of terrorism. Now, I know we had to change it a bit after 9/11, because that's what we're doing. in a lot of countries. That's the global war of terror, not on terror, but of terror. But that's what Israel's doing. By definition, they are using the threat of violence and violence to change the political structure of Gaza, of Palestine. They want the government of Hamas out because Hamas will not bend the knee and let the settlers in and let the businesses in and let them bust up areas and let Israeli developers take certain areas of Gaza and call them Israel. So they want Hamas out. Ergo, Bill Maher looks at Bill Burr and goes, "Well, you know, are you a Hamas supporter?" And Bill Burr doesn't have the fucking balls or the knowledge to say yes, which he should. Let's delve into the numbers a little bit. I just want to clarify an article I wrote a couple days ago. And I want to drill down on some of the numbers, and I want to revise some of my own. This is just an article from The Independent. Again, they're patting fucking Bill Burr on the back for exposing the bullshit, the fraud that fucking Bill Maher has become. More details on my 539 civilians article. This is the article here. And in this article, from May 9th, 2024, a little over a week ago, I used the latest figures, and this is from Al Jazeera. And here are the latest figures. Now, Israel's war on Gaza, latest figures October 7th through May 9th, Palestinian numbers, and of course, the Israeli numbers. These are killed and injured. And they used decent sources for these. They use Palestinian Ministry of Health, Palestinian Red Crescent Society, the Israeli Army, the IDF, and of course, Israel's Social Security Agency to derive these numbers. There is a flaw in one of these numbers, and that is this one. Israelis killed since October the 7th, between October the 7th and May 9th in this conflict. They say at least 1,139. That number, 1,139, does come from a specific source. However, the specific source stipulates the 1,139 were killed not from October the 7th to May 9th, but indeed on October the 7th. There are a number, about 300, a little over 300, that should be added to that number. They do say at least, but they went with the least number. But that is an official number. However, it is not accurate. Let's talk about the accurate ones. So this is the article I wrote today. It's a little deeper dive. Somebody asked me about this. I want to give him a tip of the hat, but I'm not going to give anybody's name out. But I'm tip of the hat for. He's asked me about where I get specific numbers from, and so I dove a bit more into it, and I found this information. Let's talk about this. This is one article titled "Israel's Social Security Data Reveals True Picture of October the 7th Deaths." A more precise picture of Hamas's October the 7th attack on Israel has emerged from Social Security data, referenced in the image I showed you before, confirming the unprecedented scale of violence, but also challenging some initial testimonies. You remember we were told 1,800, over 2,000 killed at first, and then 1,800 killed, and then 1,400 killed, and then 1,200 civilians killed. Keep those in mind. The final death toll from the attack on October the 7th is now thought to be 695 Israeli civilians, including 36 children, as well as 373 security forces, 71 foreigners, giving a total of 1,139, which is where that number comes from. This was published on May the 14th, 2024. So that's what the 1,139 number came from. So far, 604 soldiers have been killed on or since October the 7th. That was an article published April 2024, 604. So my numbers then from the 1,139, I used the 600 number and subtracted the 600 number. The IDF had lost 600 soldiers, and I came to the 539 number. That's how I derived that number. That was how I got 539. I still think to this day that my number 539 is closer than 695 in terms of the number of civilians lost, and I'll explain that in a second. A second source for that 600 number, the Associated Press, May 14th, 2024. More than 600 Israeli soldiers have been killed since Hamas launched its surprise attack on October the 7th. So that's 600 total civilians, which means if their numbers, right now, the numbers are still up in the air in terms of how many civilians, but if we go with the Social Security numbers, that number is 695. And that number is not going to change all that much because Hamas isn't attacking Israeli civilians in Israel and hasn't been. It hasn't deliberately been targeting them at all. But they haven't been like launching fucking rockets into fucking places. Maybe a few civilians have been killed since then, but the numbers from October the 7th, from their Social Security office. Now you have to ask yourself, is that an accurate number? Has that also been propagandized? Don't know. But it's not 1,200 civilians were killed by the marauders on October the 7th in Israel. The number was 695. Now, after that, there are other questions. This is from an article from the Black Agenda Report, dated, I don't know what the date was. It's relatively recent. U.S. audiences being shielded from reports of IDF killing Israeli civilians on October the 7th. In the wake of October 7th, after Israel began its genocidal campaign against Gaza, reports began to emerge from the Israeli press of incidents in which Israeli troops made decisions to open fire on Hamas targets regardless of whether Israeli civilians were present. That the IDF's initial reaction was chaotic at best is well documented. Much of the early military response came from the air, with little information for pilots or drone operators to distinguish targets, but orders to shoot anyway. Let me stop for a second. If you recall, I covered when this was breaking, or this news came out, early in the process, and still in October. And reports came from Apache attack helicopter pilots who reported that once they got airborne and they went over into the area and it was just chaos everywhere, they were told to fire on everything. They perceived this as an attempt at an invasion. They didn't know exactly what was going on. It was chaos. Just make sure you kill Palestinians. And so there was little to nothing to distinguish between a Palestinian civilian who was Hamas or an Israeli civilian. And so they admitted they fired on pretty much anything and everything. And we're going to show you the results of some of that in a few seconds. They also stated, and I remember this, and I covered this when the news first came out, that when they ran dry, they turned and went back to the fucking to their airport, wherever the fucking base was. They got reloaded with munition, including rockets, and went back up into the air and did it again. And they kept doing that. And there was to think that they did not kill Israeli civilians during that onslaught is foolish. It is childish. You're living in a pipe dream. Of course they did. And that wasn't just Apache attack helicopters firing on this situation, this chaotic situation, blind. It was also drone pilots with Hellfire rockets, which leave a very unique and distinguishable fingerprint when it comes to the residue of high explosives. Very easy to discern, which is one of the reasons they buried this fucking all the metal from the cars. But it wasn't just that. I remember covering one video where a number of IDF soldiers were on the road and there were cars that had to stop because of the chaos. They were hiding behind civilian, recording the shit with his phone and his family in the fucking Suburban or some shit, and literally hiding behind his vehicle were IDF soldiers shooting over the hood of his car at what was presumably Palestinians out in the field. They could have been anybody. They could have been Israeli fucking security from the goddamn rave, who, by the way, carry fucking AK-47s. They could have been Israeli security from the kibbutz, who, by the way, carry AK-47s, carry all kinds of fucking weapons, and wear civilian clothing, like the Palestinians would have been. So, I mean, and of course, fire was being exchanged back and forth. It was chaos. But again, to think that we know what happened with the tanks. That was obvious. That's been documented. We know what happened with the tanks. But this is what happened with the fucking Apache attack helicopters. This is what happened with the fucking drones. And this is what happened with soldiers. People even on the ground level, eye to eye, shooting at people in crowds and hiding behind civilians who might also get shot. I mean, this was, to say that the 695 civilians, Israeli civilians, were all killed by Palestinians is ludicrous. I would say that the number that I gave, 539 actually killed by Palestinians, would be high in an environment like that. Plus, you got to remember, they weren't there to take the land like the IDF is doing now. They weren't there to inflict punishment on the civilians. They were there to kill fucking IDF soldiers, to kill fucking police, to grab as many hostages as they could, and to get back across the fucking border because the hostages were the most important thing. So, in a lot of ways, it was probably suggested to them, a living Israeli hostage is worth a hell of a lot more to us than a dead civilian. And my guess is the majority of people, the 695 people, the civilians who were killed by the Israelis. Which, of course, is why, as I remind you, the Israeli military intelligence chief has resigned over his leadership responsibility for the Hamas-led October the 7th attack into southern Israel, which led to the killing of 1,200 people. They stopped saying civilians now. Now it's people, which is 1,139, not 1,200. And another 250 kidnapped. Major General Haliva is the first senior military figure to step down over the Hamas attack on October the 7th, which was the deadliest day for Israel since its founding. That's from April of 2024, and it's not some wild fucking, that's CNN. Clearly he understood that there's going to be a price to pay. And he paid it. He resigned. Now, he resigned on good terms before an investigation would come out and turn that 695 into something much, much less, but much worse for the IDF. At which point, he might not even be given the opportunity to resign. Because remember, this is the Hannibal Directive. What we're talking about here is, now you can go and read a bit about the Hannibal Directive at Barr. Hannibal Directive, you can also look into a little bit. I covered it a while ago, but you can look up into it if you scroll way fucking down here and find the Hannibal Directive here. I've talked about it before. And what's important to remember about the Hannibal Directive is this. The Hannibal Directive, they said, is the justification. They say it's better for Israel, and it's better for a little Israel to kill a hostage or two than to negotiate with the terrorists. But that's not what the Hannibal Directive was actually meant to mean. The Hannibal Directive is meant to mean it's better for you to kill an IDF soldier who's being held hostage than negotiate with a terrorist. Not wholesale slaughter of civilians. People, this might also be a little offensive to some, but it's out there and it should be discussed. A lot of the IDF folks are Zionists or Likudniks or are on the payroll or are on the payroll of such individuals. And when this happened, you have to ask yourself something. It was, trigger free. You'd I don't know what the actual term is because I'm not a military guy, but just fire on whomever. That was the across the board for the drone operators, for the fucking Apache attack helicopter pilots, for soldiers on the ground, and for tank commanders. What are you doing? Just take out everybody. You have to ask yourself this. Folks think this might have been a false flag event, that Hamas didn't do anything, or Hamas was run by the IDF or some shit, which is bullshit. But it's not necessarily an either or proposition. Hamas did this. And Palestinian resistance groups did this. They did this because they needed to draw attention to the fact that, first of all, Benjamin Netanyahu had just gone to the UN and held up a fucking map of the new Middle East with Palestine completely gone and everything is Israel. Just completely wiped off the map. That was 2 weeks before this happened. But also because Nakba never stopped. It never stopped. The first Intifada stopped. The second Intifada stopped. But Nakba never stopped. I covered this the very first day this happened. The next day this happened. My first article on this, my first video on this talked about the fact that, what are you saying this was not fucking, nobody saw this coming? Or what do you mean this was not provoked? 230 something Palestinians have been killed by Israel from January 1st of 2023 to October the 6th, compared to less than 20 or 24 or 20, less than 20 Israelis. That's 230 to less than 20. So the Nakba hadn't stopped. The attempt to keep stealing land and stealing land and stealing land. And of course, during the Trump administration, they just kept stealing land and stealing land and stealing land. Something had to be done because they were being wiped off the fucking map. And people who are occupied have a right to resist. 145 nations recognize Palestine as a state. The UN continuously votes to do that, and we continuously stop them. Nobody else. We do it. Because of people like Bill Maher. They have a right to resist. What happened on October the 7th was a last-ditch effort. A chance to try to strike out, to let the Israelis know that they're not as safe as the IDF and the fucking Likudniks and the people in the Knesset tell them they are. And use that in order to have them pressure for some kind of change and maybe a recognition of Palestine as a Palestinian state and Israel to finally put an end to this conflict once and for all. That's how you put an end to the conflict. Bill Maher says you put an end to the conflict by not ever attacking Israel again. That's how you do it. Stupid rat fuck. You put an end to the conflict by having Israel recognize Palestine. And by so doing, then all the Arab states that won't recognize Israel will in turn recognize Israel. And then it's just the fucking zealots and the psychopaths who are screeching and angry because they can't get their hands on a piece of property and fucking on a beach in Gaza. That's how you do that. That's the solution. Lastly, I want to show you this picture. I've told you this before, and I'll tell you one more time. Whatever bullshit little fucking rockets, homemade bullshit they have in fucking Palestine, Molotov cocktail does not do that to a fucking vehicle. That is a temperature, that is a heat, that is an explosion, that is damage. Those aren't just burned, those are fucking pulverized. A grenade doesn't do that. Their bottle rockets don't do that. Those were destroyed by Apache attack helicopters and their air-to-ground missiles, and by drones using our Hellfire rockets. And they are called Hellfire for a reason, not because it sounds cool, but because they burn extremely hot. Pitted in all of that metal is all the evidence you would ever need, because you cannot fucking remove the material. You cannot remove the evidence, the fingerprints, the forensic science of understanding and evaluating where an explosion happened, how an explosion happened, where the fucking what high explosives were used, and in some cases, if there are taggants involved, where those high explosives came from, who manufactured them, when they were manufactured, what batch were they manufactured from. All of that and more was right there. And they shredded it. First of all, they put it all in one place under lock and key to make sure nobody could get near it. Oddly enough, we did the same thing with the steel from 9/11. They put it where no one can get to it. Then they carefully shredded it all. And they compressed it all. But even melting it, you couldn't separate either the taggants or the fucking elements that they would find in them. The nitrates that would prove that those were what kind of high explosives they were. That wouldn't even do it. So you couldn't even fucking recycle them and hide it. So what they did was they shredded them, they compressed them, and they took them to Jewish cemeteries where they buried them because they said, oh, they might still have some piece of a Jewish person in them. So they had to bury them in Jewish cemeteries. And why do they do that, boys and girls? Because it is illegal to exhume bodies in Israel. You can't do that according to Jewish custom. Once somebody's buried, they're buried, and you can't get a court order, you can't get anything. That's it. It's done. That's their religion. That's why they did it. It's the safest place in the world. Unless, of course, they said they buried him in a Jewish cemetery and they dug holes in Jewish cemeteries, but they actually snuck him out of the country someplace, because that's all the evidence they need right there. That even the 695 number is too high. In all likelihood, more Israeli civilians were killed by the IDF on October the 7th, 2023, than were killed by Hamas or any Palestinian resistance group. And I firmly believe that. Now, going back to what I was talking about, that's There's no doubt. There's no doubt that whatever Hamas has cannot do that. Whatever Hamas has cannot do that. And those were occupied vehicles. Some of them were occupied. Now, lastly, to address the false flag accusations or theories, that's ridiculous. However, there is it's not an either or situation. Either it was a false flag or Hamas did it. Well, not necessarily. Hamas did do it. But what if the order came down, something free, target free? What's the fucking military word, the term I'm looking for? Targets free? Whatever the fucking term is. Shoot everybody. We've got to stop the Palestinians, so shoot everybody. We'll deal with it later. Which we know was the order. We know that was the order. It was a quote-unquote Hannibal directive, using the Hannibal directive as cover for it. But what if that order came down from people who understood this was their chance, this was their Zionist dream, and in order to get there, they needed a higher body count? What if the decision wasn't simply made to stop Hamas and their invasion because they're going to come take over all of Israel? What if the decision was made because they knew that they needed as high a body count as possible to justify what they were going to do afterwards? Now, that's not a false flag. Sort of. Anyway, I just wanted to give you some clarification on that. The 536, what did I say, 539 to start with? That number is not the official number. The official number of civilians killed, not 539, but 695 is the official number of Israeli civilians killed on October the 7th, 2023, during the incursion. I would posit that the majority of them were killed by Israelis and not by Palestinians. Anyway, I'm going to take a minute off and then make another video for you. I'll talk to you. Bye-bye.